Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Lisa Sawsville, and I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Coverts Woodlands for Wildlife. We're a statewide nonprofit that works to educate landowners and others about sound forest management and wildlife stewardship. And we're very excited today to have Nick Fortin, who is the moose and deer biologist for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, to share with us about sort of the coexistence of deer and habitat and how all that works together in the management of the herd for the state. Before we get started, I do want to have a few housekeeping items. Please mute yourselves so that we don't have the background noise. We'll have the chat going, so you can type any questions in the chat and we'll hit those at the end. And I hope you enjoy our presentation. And at this point, I'm just going to turn it over to Nick.
Thank you, Lisa. As Lisa mentioned, I'm Nick Fortin, deer and moose biologist for Vermont Fish and Wildlife. And I'm going to talk about, as Lisa said, kind of the intersection of our deer populations and deer habitat, mainly forest habitat, in this state, and kind of how we consider that in our management and some of the history we're dealing with there. So I will share my screen here.
If Nick's doing that, I'm going to say, if you feel like it, type in where you're from in the state. You know, we're all about connections with Vermont Covered. So in the chat, where are you from?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot of important context too, and where you are in Vermont makes a big difference in how we talk about this stuff. Just, I guess, a little background on myself before I get into this. I've been the deer biologist for Vermont Fish and Wildlife for, I'm in my 11th year now. So I've been doing this for a little while. I'm from Vermont originally, grew up in the Northeast Kingdom. So I have kind of a long history here, and I'm going to start with talking about an even longer history, because I think in understanding this, it's really important that we understand how this all evolved and how we got to where we are today. So first, history of our forest, right? When European settlers arrived, Vermont was almost entirely forested. Deer were widespread throughout the state, but probably a lot less common or a lot less abundant than they are today, and probably would have varied a lot. Some areas would have had no deer. Some areas, for short periods of time, might have had fair numbers of deer. As European settlers kind of settled the land and began clearing, for their farms, there were, of course, no regulations on hunting of anything. So deer were, for the most part, shot on sight because they were food, right? And so as settlers continued to clear the land, the combination of both loss of most of their habitat, which is primarily forest here, and unregulated hunting led to the extirpation of deer from most of Vermont. So deer were basically gone from Vermont by the early 1800s. There was a little remnant population up in Essex County, which was never cleared for agriculture. Anyone who's been up there, the soil is rock, basically. It's not good for farming, so it was never cleared. So some deer held on there, but everywhere else, deer were basically wiped out. In the later 1800s, post-Civil War, a lot of those poor quality hill farms started to get abandoned. They regenerated back into forest, as our landscape does here in the Northeast. And so the forest started to return. And with that, and with a little help, there's a group of folks around Rutland that actually reintroduced deer to Rutland County in I believe it was 1878. So as forests were returning, deer were reintroduced there, and that remnant population in the Northeast Kingdom kind of helped seed the population we have today. And then as we move into the 1900s, of course, forests are coming back. There was another wave of farm abandonment in the kind of early 1900s. And by the mid 1900s, that resulted in most of Vermont being young, regenerating forests, all those old pastures that had grown back into trees. And this was phenomenal deer habitat. across the entire state and led to very high numbers of deer. Not quite double what we have today, but probably close to double the number of deer we have today. So that's the landscape history. I think many of you probably are aware of a lot of that. The deer history is also relevant here, and I think obviously closely related. So modern deer hunting started in 1897 in Vermont, and from 1900 on, we have harvest reported by town in the state. So we know what town deer were taken from. And that can give us a really good idea of the distribution of deer around the state, right? We can use the deer that hunters take as a proxy for the deer population, both the number of deer and for where they are in the state. And so the map here on the left, each little green dot represents one deer taken in that underlying town. So obviously we don't have the exact location, but if there's 3 dots in a town, it means there were 3 deer taken in that town in that year. And then the chart on the right will be a bar chart, and that'll show the number of deer taken each year, and you see how that changes over time. So I'm going to walk through this pretty quick, but again, starting in 1900, not many deer, pretty sparse all around the state, little cluster down around Rutland County. That's probably where those deer were reintroduced. But fast forward to the 1960s, and you can see this exponential growth in our deer population, our deer harvest, probably representative of our deer population. And you can also see where most of those deer were taken. A lot in central Vermont, a lot in Rutland County. The other part I'll point out on the bar chart here is the dark green portion is the buck harvest, so antlered male deer. The light green portion, which only occurs in a few years, is the antlerless harvest. So that's mostly female deer. So you notice for the first 70 years of deer hunting in Vermont, we basically had buck-only deer hunting. So antlerless deer could not be taken. And this is sort of unique to Vermont. Most of our neighboring states allowed hunters to take any deer, buck or doe. But Vermont, we weren't the only one in the country, but we were the only one in the Northeast that allowed only bucks to be taken. So by the 1960s, there are really high deer numbers. They're doing a lot of damage to their habitat. And so through the 70s, deer populations kind of sputtered. They would, anytime you got a hard winter, literally thousands of deer would starve to death. The habitat was heavily degraded. It was a pretty bad situation. And then I'll add that over this time, the legislature controlled deer hunting regulations. In 1978, so beginning in the 1979 hunting seasons, the Fish and Wildlife Department was finally given control over annual season setting rules. And the department took a pretty aggressive approach. So in 3 years, 79, 80, and 81, and I'll talk about this multiple times through this, but the department aggressively worked to reduce deer numbers, held them low through the 80s to allow habitats to recover, allow deer health to recover. And then the population was allowed to increase again into the 90s. And you can see by the late 90s on the bar chart there, we've got more consistent antlerless deer harvest every year, kind of getting into our modern deer management period. There were a couple hard winters in the early 2000s. That led to a couple other regulation changes that we still have in place today. Like many of you probably are aware, we have an antler point restriction for bucks, protects some young bucks from harvest. That went in place in 2005, in part because of these population declines. Since that time, we've had a pretty stable deer population. We harvest a lot of antlerless deer every year to keep it stable like it is now. But that's really what we've been shooting for, is stability, whether that's natural or not. That's what our goal is, right? Is a stable deer population. Now, anyone who was paying attention to the map for most of this may have noticed that there was a significant difference in the distribution of deer between the 60s and today. Right. Deer numbers are not that dramatically different overall. I mean, there was a peak in the 60s, but from the late 60s to today, roughly similar numbers of deer around the state. But where those deer are is very different today than it was in the late 60s or the 70s. Right. Mostly central and southern Vermont 50 plus years ago. Today, the vast majority of our deer are in northwestern Vermont, really most of the Champlain Valley, but especially Franklin and Grand Isle counties. Orleans County is doing pretty good nowadays. Those places in central Vermont that used to have a lot of deer, today, a lot of them do not. They're pretty sparse. And the main reason for that is habitat, right? Most of our deer today live in areas with fragmented habitat, right? A mix of forest and field. They're often described as an edge species, so they're really thriving on those edge habitats and also taking advantage of those agricultural fields for more food. So that's where most of our deer are
today. I'm on the Zoom already.
The other thing, of course, here is the quality of our forest habitats. The areas with big blocks of forest, the southern Green Mountains, parts of central Vermont, those forested habitats, which is most of our deer habitat, are just not good quality deer habitat, and they cannot support a lot of deer anymore like they used to 60 years ago, right? Those forests are not the same today as they were 60 years ago. So in Vermont, when we're talking about deer habitat, we're really talking about our forests, right? We are one of the most heavily forested states in the country. And 80% of what we consider to be deer habitat, which is essentially anything that isn't paved or open water, is forest. So that the quality of those forest habitats really drives our deer population. So kind of shifting into how we manage deer now, we do not manage deer at a statewide level. Right, that we have no goals for deer management that are the same across the entire state. We break the state into what we call wildlife management units. There are 21 of them, and each one of those units has its own deer density objectives. We set harvest quotas, how many antlerless deer we're going to take differently for each one of those units. So we really don't do anything the same across the entire state because our deer populations vary a lot from one area to another. So we have these deer density objectives as how many deer we think, our staff think these areas can support long term. But I want to emphasize that this is an estimate, right? These areas, I'm going to go back one slide. So these areas are still relatively large. In the deer management world, we would consider this relatively precise management. We're managing at a small scale. But each one of these management units, they average, I think, a little over 400 square miles each. So they're large areas still. And so when we're talking about management of these areas, it's really important to understand the context of how we come up with numbers and what they really mean, right? So I'm going to show just an example here. This is made up, but just an example of how we would estimate deer density in a WMU, because this is the number you're going to hear us say, right? This is what we're going to say for how many deer there are in a given area. Based on the data we can collect, which mostly comes from the deer hunters harvest, how many did they harvest, or the ages of those deer, how many males and females and fawns, what is our reproductive rate, what is our mortality rate. We can pretty reliably estimate how many deer, total number of deer, are in a wildlife management unit, right? So across this entire unit, we come up with an estimate. There's this many total deer. And as an example here, to keep the math simple, let's say maybe this is 100 square mile WMU, and there are 2,000 deer estimated to be in it. that comes out to 20 deer per square mile. That's where those numbers come from. If you hear us throw a density estimate, it's taking the total number of deer in a WMU, dividing by the size of that WMU to give you an estimate. But I think we all understand that deer are not perfectly evenly distributed across the landscape, right? There are not 20 deer in every square mile in that WMU. In reality, the distribution of deer is much more clustered. You see a lot of variability even within a management unit. This is especially true in Vermont, where our landscape is so variable. And so I show this to emphasize that just because we say something at the broad scale that we manage does not mean that's what you're going to see on a given property, right? Maybe there's 3 deer per square mile in one area. Maybe there's 30 deer per square mile in another area. All of that can occur in a unit where we would say, oh, there's 20 deer per square mile. So just to emphasize, there's a lot of variability, and this makes management really complex, both our deer management and, of course, trying to deal with deer from a forest management perspective. This makes it very complex. Another kind of important aspect here, yes, we have these density objectives. They're great. It's really intuitive for people to understand, like, okay, how many deer are we trying to have on the landscape? And it's easy for us to set, harvest quotas and say, well, we have more than we want, so we're going to try to reduce. But those density objectives are at the end of the day, they're basically a best guess by our biologists based on all the information we have. And I would argue they're well informed, but we don't actually know the carrying capacity. We are making an educated guess. So for a more objective way to measure whether we have too many deer or not, for whatever our habitat is, we also look at the health of our deer, the physical condition of deer in each WMU, and we have these kind of minimum thresholds set. And I'm not going to go through all these, but we're looking at things like antler size in male deer, especially young male deer, because antlers are bonus material, right? So if a deer is in poor health, the first thing they're going to take nutrition or energy away from is their antlers. They don't need those. So antlers are one of the first things that shrink when deer are in poor health. We also look at body weight. Again, less healthy deer are going to have smaller body weights. And then on the female side, what is the birth rate? A less healthy doe is going to produce fewer fawns. Those fawns are going to be smaller because she can't produce as much milk. So this gives us a more objective understanding of, do we have too many deer for our habitat in an area, or are they in balance, or could we support more deer? Are deer really healthy? They're actually doing okay. Regardless of where we are relative to our density goal, the health gives us that really solid understanding. And so to look at one of those, this is yearling antler beam diameter. Again, it's just a measure of antler size in 1.5-year-old male deer. And it's one we've tracked for a long time, all the way back into the 60s. So remembering those slides I showed you about deer numbers, remember in the 60s and 70s, we had way too many deer. Habitat was really poor shape. So you saw these lower antler beam diameters. And then in 1980, 81, when the population was reduced, right? The department killed all those antlerless deer, reduced deer numbers. You see this pretty dramatic improvement in the health of deer into the early 90s. And then for the past 30 years, we see this long, slow, steady decline in beam diameters in the health of our deer. And the immediate reaction of most people would be, well, of course, deer numbers have increased in that time, right? So we have more deer for our habitat. But deer numbers haven't actually changed much over the past, this is 25 years, the period we have actual estimates for. But even going back in the 90s, it wouldn't have changed much. So if deer numbers haven't changed over the past 30 years, why is their health declining? Why does it appear that we have too many deer for our habitat? Well, it's not deer numbers. It's going to be the other side of that equation, which is the habitat, right? Our forests in Vermont, as we're all aware, are getting older. Most of our forests look more like the photo on the right here. They're relatively mature, somewhat, and more importantly than being mature, they're even aged, right? All of the trees are about the same size, the same age, because they all were generated from farm fields at roughly the same time. And so that forest on the right there, which is what most of Vermont looks like, is terrible deer habitat. There's nothing for deer to eat. There's no cover. The amount of young forest habitat, like the photo on the left, where there's, a lot of green stuff within reach of deer, a lot of places for them to hide fawns from predators. The amount of that young forest habitat really drives how many deer a given area of forest can support. And of course, we have less and less and less of that habitat every year, just for a lot of reasons beyond the scope of this presentation. But less young forest means we cannot support as many deer. And of course, we all want, our goal as an agency, even when we're talking about managing deer, our ultimate goal is to have healthy, diverse, resilient forests, ecosystems that can support however many deer we want, as well as the full suite of other species that live in those forests. And to get to this state, this desired forest ecosystem from where we are now, is going to require both active forest management and also active deer management. I really encourage folks to consider or think of managing deer on a property as an aspect of managing forests, because you're not going to get the healthy forest you want unless you also consider deer management as part of that, right? Again, we could spend a whole presentation talking about how that works, but it's a complex interaction. We have to think of both parts. But my job, of course, as a deer manager, is to think about the deer management part and how do we help landowners, land managers have the tools to effectively manage deer on their property so they can effectively manage their forest, achieve their forest management goals. So to that end, I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about some changes to deer hunting regulations that are taking effect this year that will hopefully provide those tools to landowners. There are a lot of changes here. There are 8 specific things that we changed that'll be new for this year. I'm not going to go into all of these, but I want to touch on a few of them that I think are important and do kind of offer these tools to help better manage deer when and where we need it. So the first one here, establishing expanded archery zones. So this rule essentially extends our archery deer hunting season into kind of earlier to the middle of September. So in these 8 very specific zones, and I would argue most people should probably think of this as like a suburban archery zone. If you're a forest landowner, you probably don't live in one of these areas. This is more about kind of urban, suburban deer, places where we can't manage deer with firearms effectively for a variety of reasons. We want to encourage more archery deer hunting. So we have these 8 areas where you get an extra 16 days of hunting in October, archery hunting. Hopefully going to target some of our harvest to these problem areas or potential problem areas. So that's one tool. The next set of changes are actually just undoing things we changed in 2020. We do, we're just moving the timing of youth weekend back to its original timing. We're tweaking our antler restriction in one WMU where it wasn't working. I'm not going to spend time on those. Next three here, though, these are expansions of hunting opportunity, expansions of hunting seasons. I grouped these three together because they're all an easing of restrictions, an expansion of opportunity, but we don't expect them to have much impact on the total number of deer that are taken. So, like, from my perspective, this is more for hunters or landowners, giving more flexibility, more options, but it's not overall going to really drive anything. We're not going to suddenly kill twice as many deer because of any of these. But nonetheless, they are important, so I want to spend a little time. First is removing the archery closure during the regular season. So if you're a deer hunter, archery hunter, you may be aware of this. If you're not a deer hunter, you probably aren't aware of this, but our archery deer hunting season previously started October 1st and ran up until the Friday before our regular November rifle season. And then it was closed for the 16 days of rifle season. And then archery season opened again on the Monday immediately after rifle season. The reason it was closed was because antlerless deer couldn't be taken during the regular season. And archery hunters can always take antlerless deer, anywhere, anytime. If it's archery season, you have an archery license, you can always take antlerless deer. But this was sort of a law enforcement issue, right? We didn't want hunters taking an antlerless deer during rifle season and then just claiming they'd shot it with their bow. So that's the reason that closure existed. Now that we are going to allow antlerless deer to be taken during the regular season, this is unnecessary. So we've removed this closure. Archery season just runs continuously right through. In reality, most hunters, given a choice, they're going to choose to use a gun over a bow. But a few diehard bow hunters will now have the chance to go out archery hunting during these 16 days. Or folks who've already filled their buck tag during rifle season can now go bow hunting. So it's more opportunity, more flexibility. As a landowner, it gives you a chance to have someone there with an archery tag. Again, always can take antlerless deer for an extra 16 days. So great flexibility, but because we don't think a lot of hunters are going to take advantage of it, we don't expect it to have a huge impact on overall harvest numbers. The other one here was extending the muzzleloader season, and I just want to point out that this was actually a petition. This wasn't even a department recommendation. This was a request made to the Fish and Wildlife Board to add 5 days to the December muzzleloader season. We didn't oppose it as a department, and the board supported it. So this one did go through, and so our December muzzleloader season historically has been started on the weekend after the end of our regular rifle season again. So that regular season ends the Sunday after Thanksgiving. There was no gun hunting during the week, and then the following weekend, that December muzzleloader season started. Now that December muzzleloader season will start the Monday immediately after rifle season. Again, that's 5 extra days for hunters. But what we think is going to happen is that hunters are just going to adjust when they hunt. Most folks don't have more time off. These are only weekdays. But it gives more flexibility. Seasons are less impacted by weather when they're longer like this. It's also more opportunity to fill antlerless permits. So again, flexibility is the main thing here. We don't expect it to increase overall numbers, but that flexibility can be really valuable when you're talking about how you, as a landowner or forest manager, kind of take advantage, or as a hunter, take advantage of regulations. And then the last one of these three was allowing hunters to hold 2 antlerless permits at a time. So I'm going to talk about antlerless permits more in a second, but previously a hunter could only hold one permit at a time. They're issued through a lottery. You get your permit, and then if you filled your permit, meaning you took a deer, an antlerless deer, and there were leftover permits available, which may or may not be the case, but if it is the case, a hunter could then go buy another permit. So you could get multiple permits, but you could only hold one at a time. Now we're going to allow hunters to hold two at a time. They do have to be for different areas. You can't hold two for the same area. But we're allowing people to have two, recognizing that some hunters travel. Maybe you got a permit for the area that you live in, but you're going to travel to this other place that has permits available. We feel like you should be able to buy those permits if they're available. So that's what this one was. Again, not going to have a huge effect, but more flexibility for hunters. And then the last two here, I'll spend a little more time on. These are the ones I think will have the greatest potential to impact, to change hunter behavior and potentially allow us to really effectively manage deer when and where we need to. It'll give us the tools we need at that broader scale that we manage. So one is, of course, allowing antlerless permits to be used during the regular season. This was a big contentious one. And the second one here is allowing hunters to take a conditional second buck. And I'm going to start with that second one. For those who aren't aware, since 2020, hunters in Vermont have only been allowed to take one antlered buck per year across all the different hunting seasons, but you can only take one antlered buck per year. And that's been a valuable tool both for managing our buck age structure, but also for kind of forcing hunters, if they want to take multiple deer, to have to take antlerless deer. There's been some value there. But it did have a bit of an unintended consequence, an undesirable consequence, in actually reducing the amount of time some hunters spend in the woods. So hunters are always primarily interested in bucks, right? Antlers are fascinating things, and we can't help ourselves. We have to, you can stand a buck and a doe right next to each other, and 99% of your hunters are going to shoot the buck no matter what. Hunters want bucks, right? They want to target bucks. And it turns out that if hunters don't have a buck tag available, or they're not willing to use their buck tag because they don't want to give up future hunting opportunities, they're oftentimes just not going to go hunting. And we saw a lot of that. We saw a lot of hunters who said, I used to archery hunt, but I don't want to shoot a buck with my bow because I don't want to give up rifle season. So I'm just not archery hunting anymore. And this has been, we essentially think of this as a buck tag. Having a buck tag in their pocket, so to speak, is what gets hunters out in the woods. A lot of those hunters are willing to shoot a doe if they get the opportunity, but they're not going to hunt unless they have a buck tag. And so this second buck opportunity is trying to get at that. Under this system, the new system, hunters can take a second buck if they, of course, buy a second buck tag. Their first buck has to meet some minimum size standards that are a little higher than our standard antler restrictions. And that's just to maintain the buck age structure goals we have. We don't want to lose that either. But then the kind of more key element of this is you have to take an antlerless deer before you can take that second buck. So we're using the second buck as an incentive to encourage hunters to try to take an antlerless deer. And so I think this has a lot of potential, not only to increase our antlerless harvest, or at least encourage more antlerless harvest, but I think the bigger effect, I hope maybe the bigger effect long term, is that this also helps to kind of shift the mentality of hunters remove some of the negative stereotypes around harvesting antlerless deer. It's going to take time. That's not going to happen overnight. But I think the more we can encourage and promote antlerless harvest among hunters, the better off we're going to be long term. And I think this is a good step in that direction. It gives hunters what they want, but it forces them to kind of work with us in order to get that. And I guess I should add just a quick, for hunters out there, you can still only get one buck per season. So one buck during archery season, one buck during rifle season, one buck during muzzleloader. You can't shoot more than one in any given season, but you can get a 2 per year if you happen to hunt multiple seasons. So that's that one. And then lastly, kind of to wrap up here, the by far the most contentious change is allowing antlerless permits to be used during our regular rifle season in November. There's a long history here, and I showed some of it, right? But this one is pretty contentious, and a lot of hunters have really strong opinions, especially older hunters. Going back to those bar graphs of deer harvest I showed earlier, right? That period in the early 80s, when the department very aggressively reduced the deer population, while that was very successful biologically and ecologically, right? It improved deer health, it improved forest health. It was a disaster socially. Hunters were livid at the dramatic reduction in the deer population. And it ultimately led in the late 80s, the legislature prohibited taking antlerless deer during rifle season by statute. It was literally illegal in Vermont to take antlerless deer during rifle season until 2015. It finally kind of just went away quietly, that prohibition. But between the impact this had on deer, regardless of what you think was good, bad, or otherwise, it had a significant impact, and the hunters didn't like it. Between the impact it had on deer and then it being illegal for 30 plus years, it created a stigma among Vermont hunters that it is taboo to shoot antlerless deer with a rifle. It's okay to shoot them with a bow or with a muzzleloader, but for some reason with a rifle it wasn't okay. It's a fascinating thing. We're the only state in the country that I'm aware of that does not allow antlerless deer, or had not previously allowed antlerless deer to be taken during our regular firearm season. So there's a lot, right? There's a lot going on here. But it's really important that we need this tool nowadays. So the reason we need this tool, the reason our old system didn't work, is because we couldn't take antlerless deer during our regular rifle season, which is when most hunters hunt. We had to move to a system where archery hunters can take antlerless deer whenever they want, but archery hunters are archery hunters. They're hunting with a bow and arrow. There's a limit to how much they can do. There aren't that many of them. It's difficult to kill deer that way. There's a limit to what archery hunters can do. The other way we killed antlerless deer was during our muzzleloader season in December originally, and then we added a 4-day season, which I show on here, in 2020 in October. But we instead of doing it during rifle season, we issued our antlerless permits during our muzzleloader season. So what I wanted to show here is that our current fill rate, over the past decade or so, our fill rate on those antlerless permits is about 14%. The fill rate so a 14% fill rate means for every 100 antlerless permits we give out, about 14 antlerless deer are taken, right? The success rate's you can think of it as success rate. Some people don't try to fill their tag. That's why we don't call it a success rate. But the point here is that say I was trying to kill 140 antlerless deer in a given wildlife management unit. That's actually a pretty average number. That's pretty typical of a lot of units in Vermont. To kill 140 antlerless deer with antlerless permits, I would have to issue 1,000 permits. Now, more opportunity, right? That sounds all good. The problem is that there are a lot of WMUs where we don't have 1,000 muzzleloader hunters. We have plenty of hunters. We just don't have 1,000 muzzleloader hunters. So this is our sort of pool of deer hunters, I guess, if you want to think the different seasons that they hunt. The big orange square is the hunters who hunt the regular season. The yellow square is the hunters who hunt archery season. The blue square rectangle is the hunters who hunt our muzzleloader season. And then where they overlap are the hunters who hunt multiple seasons, right? And so you can see pretty much everyone hunts the regular season. And a pretty good chunk of hunters hunt all three. But we had been limiting ourselves with our antlerless permits to only that 44% of hunters who hunt the muzzleloader season. We have all the rest of our deer hunters are not able to get antlerless permits. They have never been able to get antlerless permits, or in recent times have never been able to get antlerless permits. And even though archery hunters can shoot antlerless deer, again, they didn't have the opportunity to do it with a gun. So by opening this up, we've not only added time to when people can fill antlerless permits, but we've opened our pool of potential hunters up tremendously. We've more than doubled the number of people that can potentially take antlerless permits. So we're not going to run into this ceiling issue anymore. We can still control how many permits are issued every year, but we're not going to run into this issue where we need to kill more antlerless deer, but we simply can't. There's just no way to issue permits. This gives us that tool to do what we need to do when we need to do it. And I think equally important, maybe more, but I think equally important, it's just more equitable. It gives everyone an opportunity to take antlerless deer if that's what they're interested in, not just people who happen to muzzleloader hunt. So that's where this one comes from. That's why we need this tool. We need, in some areas, not everywhere, but in some areas, we need to be able to kill more antlerless deer, and this gives us that tool. And so just to end here, our goal in all of this in deer management is just giving people the tools to effectively manage deer. Like we're trying to do it at a broad scale, at a statewide scale, but we also want to give people the option at the smaller scale. If you're a landowner, if you're a land manager, or if you're a hunter who just, has an interest in your own particular little pocket of the world that you hunt, we want to make sure the tools are available to manage deer so that we can effectively manage our forest ecosystems and have those healthy, resilient ecosystems that we all want to have moving forward. And so with that, I will stop now and open it up to questions. You're muted, Lisa.
Geez, thanks. Thanks so much. And I want to point out we have a variety of people on that are landowners or hunters, or landowners that aren't hunters, or so a whole variety of questions show up in the chat, sort of relating to these aspects. But can you just say the overall goal of these changes was for deer health and forest health? Would that be accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Healthy deer and healthy forests make healthy deer.
All right, I'm going to run through these. Some people had a question about density and how it was, but I think you ended up explaining it after they asked their question. If that's not true, the people who wrote about that, go ahead and throw it back in the chat as I work my way down. But I'm pretty sure, the way he explained the density and then the groupings of the deer kind of made a little more sense, and your questions were before that. So let's skip over those for a minute. I answered this in the chat, but I'd love for you to answer it too, Nick. Why should we care about deer populations?
I think we should care about deer populations just like we should care about any other species of wildlife out there, right? Having deer are an important part of the landscape. They're obviously the most common kind of large mammal in Vermont that people are likely to see. Um, they have a lot of values, from their ecological values to just their kind of social values, the opportunity for people to see them. Um, Same reason you'd care about any wildlife, I guess. We want to have healthy populations. Uh, and yes, sometimes they can be overabundant, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to manage them all the same.
Okay, great. Someone sort of had a question, forested versus like the yummy things they find around our house. So it reads, if we manage our forested areas to support deer, will that reduce the damage done to gardens and areas around homes? She says she's thinking about why some people would resist taking actions to improve habitat for deer when they already think there are too many.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Yeah, I mean, the part of the reason, it's not the only reason that deer come into backyards, but part of the reason we have problems with that is that's the best forage they have available. If they have more forage or better forage out in the woods away from people, most deer would much prefer to not come into your backyard. They would, that is a risk to them, and they would like to avoid that. Now, making perfect habitat is not going to draw all of those deer that have learned that your garden and landscaping is delicious. It's not going to draw them all back into the woods, but it would ideally keep future deer in the woods and not coming into your yard.
Okay, great. Next question is there a human safety concern about having archery hunters in the woods during the rifle season?
I mean, I think there's safety concerns broadly. I mean, that's always a top priority with deer hunting regulations. But generally speaking, no, because the argument here is that you have archery hunters in tree stands, or typically the argument that's been made is that you have archery hunters in tree stands, and somehow that's dangerous. But there are plenty of rifle hunters in tree stands just the same. It's really no different. The implement you're using doesn't change the safety aspects of it. We always have hunters in the woods. We're always concerned about safety, but we don't feel that any of these new regulations make anything less safe than the way it's been.
So know your target and wear orange.
Yes.
All right. Let's see. Do muzzleloader guns cause more distress than regular rifles, or the same for bow and arrow?
I guess I'm going to assume that this means. Well, I'm going to interpret this as, do they kill as effectively? Because certainly the sound of the shot is not a concern or anything. I think rifles can be more effective at killing deer, more cleanly, humanely, if you will, than muzzleloaders or archery equipment. But that all of it very much comes back to the hunter and how they've practiced with that implement, and that they're not taking shots that they shouldn't be taking with that implement. So I think you could make the argument that rifles are more humane, more effective, but I would argue it ultimately comes back to the hunter making good choices.
Yeah, I would advise anybody on, if you haven't already taken the hunter safety or the archery safety class, even if you don't ever plan on hunting, there's a lot of conservation information that goes out there during the class. There's also an understanding of the implements that are being used and the practice that is needed to become proficient with them. So I think, if you haven't already taken a hunter safety, that you can take them online. Visit Vermont Fish and Wildlife for that. And I think it's a great opportunity for you to learn a little bit about this community if you don't already know it. Here's a great question. Who is going to determine or monitor if the first buck has 3 points on one side? They know check stations don't really look, and you can say whatever you want. So how are we gonna look at that?
I would say it's the same way we would enforce any other laws or rules. I mean, yes, there are check stations that don't look. Most of them do, but some of them don't. Of course, we also allow online reporting, self-reporting now during archery season and muzzleloader season. And we've considered, requiring a photo for those online reports and other options. But at the end of the day, it's sort of a self-enforced thing, except that I will say wardens can still bust you later. If you put false information on a harvest report, that is a violation. And if warden checks you later and finds out that, hey, this deer you said was a 6-pointer was actually only a 4-pointer, you're going to be in a lot of trouble because it's an intentional violation. So we can't guarantee anything right up front. That's true of unfortunately, of many of our rules. We rely on the good faith of hunters, but we have the tools, maybe more on the back end, but we have the tools to enforce any of the regulations that we put in place.
Sounds good. All right, we have a few more minutes, so I'm going to keep going through the questions. There's a couple questions about all the different kind of research that goes into, some of these decisions, as well as what we're learning and things are changing. So I'm going to kind of run through them and let you sort of overall explain what goes on. So the question is, there been research surveying done to analyze the correlation between annual take by hunters versus the overall population, with consideration to changes in hunter population, vehicle collisions, things like that. That's the first one. Then we go into a little bit about habitat. Has there been evaluate the impact of deer on high altitude habitats as fragmentation and climate change affect our deer populations? So we're looking at hunter and habitat and climate change. And how do those extreme weather events that we've been having, the flooding, the drought, they threw fire in there, not quite a Vermont concern yet, but it could be, impact deer populations in the Northeast. So let's go there. There's a couple more, but let me let you think on those first, and then we'll see about the couple rest. Because those kind of together, I think.
I think the short answer is, yeah. I mean, we've analyzed and looked into a lot of this here in Vermont. If we haven't done it, some other state or province has looked into it. As far as how many deer are taken by hunters versus the overall population, we track that pretty closely. Our harvest rate, meaning the percentage of deer that are taken, percentage of all the deer out there that are taken by hunters every year, for bucks is somewhere around 35%. So a little over a third of all the bucks out there are taken by hunters every year. Antlerless deer, it's more like 10%. There's hunter participation. So yeah, I mean, as hunter numbers, well, I'm gonna couch this a little. If hunter numbers decline, there is potential for your harvest to go down as well, right? It's harvest is always a combination of how many deer you have and how many hunters you have. The caveat there is that technology and the information that hunters have is always improving, and hunters are becoming more and more efficient at finding and killing deer every year. So those sort of balance out. The other thing is we're not really losing hunters. It's a common thing that is often thrown out there that, hunter numbers are declining. It's not really true in Vermont. We're actually holding pretty steady. We're going to lose a little as baby boomers age out, but we're doing okay. There's a thing on vehicle collisions. We do track vehicle collisions. They track deer numbers pretty well. They're actually declining, believe it or not, vehicle collisions. I believe in large part due to modern safety features on vehicles. Pedestrian detection also detects deer. So modern vehicles will stop you from hitting a deer, even if you wouldn't have stopped yourself from hitting a deer. All right, moving on. High elevation habitat part. we don't, deer are so, there's so few deer in high elevation habitats, that even I think if that, as that number might start to increase, as maybe climate change related, I don't think we would detect anything for quite some time. So we certainly haven't yet. Um, and then extreme weather. The only extreme weather that really affects deer in the Northeast is severe winters. And even that's not really extreme weather. It's when we have a really long winter, much worse than the one we're currently having, that can have a big impact on deer. Um, but otherwise, like drought and flooding, which we've had the last few years, those probably aren't doing a whole lot. Uh, in fairness, I don't think we know the impact of last year's drought yet. We'll probably see that this coming year if there's anything. But the flooding the previous years really didn't do anything to deer numbers. So I generally speaking, the extreme weather we have does not really bother deer.
Sounds good. There's been a couple that said great presentation, and some that think the changes seem thoughtfully to accommodate a variety of herd management, hunter interest, enforcement, and other objectives. So they're on board with kind of where you're taking this, or at least seeing how it goes. A few other concerns, about the different seasons overlapping and the safety, but you addressed that, so I'm not going to go on with that. And then there was sort of some questions that sort of dealt with like the ecological health of the forest, the forest reserve category and letting our forests age. And is that a better strategy, and how might that work?
Yeah, so this is a complex problem, right? The issue with our forests is not that they're old, it's that they're even aged. True old forests, old growth forests, if you want to call it that, would actually be better deer habitat than what we have now. We just need our forests to be more diverse across the board, age structure wise, species composition, all the things. We need a more diverse forest. So allowing some forests to get older will improve those areas as deer habitat. But if we allow our current even aged forest to just get older as an even aged forest, our grandchildren won't live long enough to see it improve, at least in terms of deer habitat. Active management is going to be much more effective at diversifying our forests in a shorter period of time. But we need both, right? We need more truly old forest, and then we need more young forest.
I think that's a great place to end. It's 12:59. We said this would go to 1. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. If you have further questions, go ahead and you can send them in to me, Lisa at vtcoverts.org. I'm sure Nick will appreciate any questions that you might have. And it's his first name, last name, Nick Fortin at vtfishandwildlife. What?
Vermont.gov.
At Vermont.gov. That's what it was. I was confused. You wouldn't think I typed it all the time. So Nick Fortin at Vermont.gov. And we want to thank you for spending your lunchtime with us. This will be posted online if you'd like to review it or share it with others so they understand sort of what's going on and why it's going on in order to see an improvement to our forest health and our deer population health. So Nick, thank you so much. And everyone have a great afternoon.